like to welcome everybody to tonight's chess tactics class. We're going to go over two topics. The first topic is perpetual check, and that's pretty straightforward, so there's only 3 examples, and then we move into a rook on the open file and getting the 7th rank and how you can attack with a rook on the 7th rank. And we have a large number of examples, about 10 there. So the first example I'd like to go through is perpetual check. Now, perpetual check is what you do. It's a defensive technique when you're losing the game and you're desperately looking around for a counterattack and a way to get a draw. So look at this position, and you'll see that white has 2 rooks and 2 knights, and black only has a bishop. So white is a knight and 2 rooks up. So I'd say black is desperate. So black to play to find a perpetual check. What would be the way to get that? Bishop takes G2 check. Now, if king takes bishop, which is the main line, of course, then what's the follow-up move? Queen to G4, and the king has to go back in the corner, and then queen to F3 check, and you just repeat back and forth G4 and F3. This first example is very simple, just to get the main idea across. All these examples are taken from The Game of Chess by Siegbert Tarrasch, published in 1935. He was a German author. Now, what happens if white moves the king to G1? That's a bad move, but how does black take advantage of it? What would be black's move here? That bishop takes F1. Remember, black is 2 rooks and a knight down, so winning a rook for a bishop's not going to cut it. Black has to play for checkmate or perpetual check. He's going to try to play for checkmate here.
Trying to bring the queen to the G file?
Queen to G4, perhaps?
Yes.
Let's look at it. Now the threat is bishop to F3, which is checkmate. The only possible move is pawn up, and what's black's follow-up? Bishop takes pawn check, king up, queen down to G2 check. That's the obvious move. King up here. Looks like the king's going to escape over to the queen side. So let's back up. Queen to G4 is an interesting idea, but it doesn't quite cut it. What's another idea? Why didn't queen to G4 work? White could attack the queen with the pawn. Can we make a move and block the pawn? What move would that be? Bishop to F3, and then we threaten queen to G4 check and mate, and now there's no way white can stop the checkmate, because there's no checks by the white queen, and the white knight can't check anything, and the rooks can't go anywhere. And if H3, well, we could do queen takes pawn, or we could do queen to G5 check, king to rook 2, and then queen to G2 would be checkmate. All right, so that's pretty straightforward. Let's go on to the next example. This one will be a little more complicated. Okay, so right off the bat, we see that the black bishop on D5 is attacking the white queen. We see that the bishop is protected by the queen, the black queen, and the black knight. The black knight's pinned by the white queen. The rook could take the knight with check, pulling the queen away from the bishop, so we could win 2 pieces for the rook by rook takes knight, queen takes bishop. Is there any other move besides rook takes knight check for white? I don't see a better move, so let's look at it. Let's see what happens. Rook takes knight check, queen takes. Now what does black play? Remember, tonight's topic is perpetual check as a defense. Do you see the perpetual check back here? Where can the queen check the black queen check the white king? How about you?
Queen E1?
Yes, queen to E1, and notice that the queen is also hitting the H4 pawn. The king has to go to rook 2, so that pretty much gives it away. Then queen takes pawn check, and you just move the queen back and forth, and you get your perpetual check and a draw, and you need that because white has the advantage with the 2 minor pieces against rook, plus the black rook's not in play. White's about to checkmate black otherwise, so you have to take the perpetual check. Okay, we have one more example on perpetual check. It's black to play. White's knight is unprotected, so black takes the knight. What does white play? White plays for perpetual check and gets one. There's only one check by the white queen. Queen F5 check. That either works or it doesn't work. If pawn comes up, queen takes pawn check, and we just go between F7 and F8, perpetual. And if the king goes back, well, then we just go to C8. Remember, the black queen prevented queen to C8, but when the black queen took our knight, it freed up the C8 square for the white queen. So we get the perpetual check by coming down here, and we just repeat. So that's a draw. Now, the next topic is a little more complicated. It's 10 examples of a rook on an open file with the idea of penetrating to the 7th rank, and you can attack across your opponent's 7th rank all the pawns that are lined up, pieces, and you can get a kingside attack if there are no pawns stopping the rook from getting to the king. Naturally, the rook has to be supported by a queen, a bishop, or a knight, at least one other piece. So that's what we'll be looking for in these examples. Well, there's no rook on anywhere near a 7th rank in this position, but I think we can see that it's probably white because white's position's better. Notice how the black bishop on B7 is blocked by the white pawns on D5, A6, and B5 and E6. Notice how the black knight is behind his pawns on D7. The only square he can go to is B6, but he can't get to C4, and going to A4 doesn't make much sense. So there's not any good moves for that knight. And the black squared bishop on E7 is hindered by the white pawns, which are on the black squares, E5, F4, and B4. Also note that the black king is on the 2nd rank on F7. If we can get a rook down to C7, then we can attack that bishop that's on B7. We can attack the knight and pass the knight, the bishop, and then toward the king. So that kind of begs the move rook to C1, which is our first move. Now black has to try to defend and keep. White's going to double rooks on the C file, or by maybe like rook to C3 and rook f1 to c1, and then he can even bring his queen over to c2 and have all three major pieces on the c file. So black contests the file by moving his a rook over to c8 to trade rooks. Now white needs to continue his attack. Now he could do rook takes rook because black's rook can't take back because it's blocked by the queen. And if queen takes rook, then we could do rook to c1. The rook on c1 is protected by the bishop at e3 and the knight on b3. The queen would move, and but then say the queen would go to b8, and then black would bring the other rook to c8 and try to trade that last rook off. So it's not sure how that works out. But let's see what white does. Okay, white didn't trade rooks. First, he attacks the bishop by moving knight to a5. That bishop is unprotected. So black's problem is he has to defend or move the bishop on b7, plus he has to defend the c file. So he's got a file and a bishop on b7 that he has to be concerned about. Let's see. He just retreats the bishop. Notice, though, that the white knights, the d4 knight and the a5 knight, they can drop in on c6, and they would have an attack on the queen and the bishop on e7, so white can penetrate on the c file. We're not yet ready to get a rook to the 7th rank, but the knights can lead the way into black's position. Okay, so first we did rook takes rook, queen takes. Now the rook comes over. Now the queen either has to go to b8 or to d8. He goes to b8 because he wants to leave c8 free to bring the rook over to trade rook. So if the queen had gone to d8, then he couldn't bring the rook over. So b8's really the best move. Now I think we drop one of the knights into c6. Let's see. Oh no, we don't drop the knight in, not yet. We bring the queen over. So the queen is on e2. Black is threatening rook to c8. By bringing the queen to c2, we prevent that. Black can't oppose the rook. So you see, by playing knight to a5, we drove the bishop back from b7 to a8. If we hadn't played that move, the bishop would be on b7 protecting the c8 square, and the rook could come over, and our queen move wouldn't have had any effect. So that's why this started out with knight to a5 first. All right, so black's in serious trouble here. White controls the c file and is threatening queen to c7, which would threaten queen takes knight. Queen takes queen, rook takes. The rook would threaten the knight, and black can't oppose the rook on the c file. The other threat white has is he can drop one of his knights in to c6, forking the queen and the black squared bishop. And if he moves the d4 knight, it opens up that diagonal for the bishop on e3, can come up and attack on the black diagonal from c5. After knight takes bishop on e7, king takes, we could possibly play bishop to c5 check. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Okay, so black retreats the bishop. He wants to take that knight to simplify the position. The knight drops into c6, again forking the queen. The queen moves up to b7. The knight takes the bishop. Rook takes the knight. Now notice that the black squared bishop is gone, so there's no protection for those black squares. Notice that the white bishop on e3 is on a black square, and that bishop can fall back to f2, go up to h4 and come in that diagonal, or the bishop can stay where she's at and operate toward the c5. The black rook can't oppose the black bishop is blocked by the queen on b7. So, and again, black's knight. Black's in a lot of trouble. Let's see what happens. Okay, white immediately grabs the 7th rank and threatens queen takes queen, bishop takes, and then the rook comes down, threatens the bishop and the knight. If the bishop moves back, the rook can go to a7 and win that a6 pawn. Let's see what black does. Black just retreats because he doesn't want to have a bishop. He doesn't want to allow queen takes queen, bishop, rook to the 7th attacking the bishop. He'd rather have queen takes queen, rook takes, then rook to the 7th. He can protect the knight with the king back to e8, and he doesn't lose a move by having to move his bishop. Okay, now white retreats the bishop to f2. He's contemplating going to h4, attacking the rook on d8. Queen moves up to b6. The queen is attacking the knight. Obviously, the bishop can't do the intended move, bishop to h4, because it would leave the knight unprotected. Queen takes knight check. But the queen just moved in. There's a battery. It looks like, I was thinking knight takes f pawn. The bishop would be attacking the queen, but queen takes queen would be a sufficient answer. Rook takes queen, then we could do pawn takes knight. But the fact that the queen is on the same diagonal with the bishop looks bad. Let's see what white does. White retreats the knight back to f3, attacking the queen. And the knight heads toward g5, where it would be check, attacking the king and that weak pawn on e6. Looks like black has to do queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, attacking the knight. The king goes back to protect the knight. That frees the rook up, and it gets the king out of the way of the knight check. Now the bishop comes to h4, attacking the rook. The rook can't go to c8, so the rook has to go to b8. Now the knight goes to g5 and attacks the weak e6 pawn. The knight drops back to protect the weak e6 pawn. Okay, now the white knight goes from g5 to f7, and the threat is knight to e6 check. Checkmate. Yeah, because the bishop guards the black square. Okay, so the knight has to go up there to give the king an escape square. The knight checks. The king is forced away from the knight, and rook takes knight. And that is how the rook penetrated to the 7th. Remember, we swapped off the bishop that was on black squares for black. That allowed our rook to go to c7, and our bishop that's on h4 was able to move from e3 to f2 and to h4 because there was no opposing bishop. So the bishop and the rook could coordinate along the 7th rank and penetrate into black's position, winning the game. Well, obviously white is the only one penetrating any open files with a rook. White has a rook on h4 protected by a bishop on g3. The problem is, well, it looks like if it's white's move, white could just move down to h7 and would threaten rook takes pawn on c7. So let's see what happens. Yep, rook down. Now, what happens if black defends the pawn with rook to c8? What happens then? Oh, we could do that. But look, not only are we threatening the pawn on c7, we're threatening rook to f7 check, forcing the king to a white square, and then we can put our queen on a4 on the white diagonal. The king moves over to d8. We have queen to d7 checkmate. That's stronger than attacking the queen. So let's see. Black had to block that diagonal, so he moved the pawn there so to block queen to a4 check. So unfortunately for black, white can just go to b4 and threaten queen takes pawn. Now once, that's not just queen takes pawn. Remember, first it's rook to f7 check, king to e8, then it's queen takes pawn check. So black doesn't have time to do queen to e3 attacking the bishop because we've got checkmate threatened. So let's see what black comes up with. Oh, he moved his knight. Let's see if there's any other move. What would white do if black protected the pawn with a6? This isn't in the author's book, but what would white do here? Look, we have a bishop on g3 attacking what pawn? d6, and our queen's on that pawn, and that's with check. The king would have to move over, and then we'd have queen to d7 checkmate, or king back to f8, then queen or rook to f7 checkmate. So that's the answer. Bishop takes pawn check. Let's see what black did. Black moved the knight. I don't see that helps him. Oh, if rook to f7, he can go the other direction, but then he loses his knight. So let's see what white does. Oh, he moved there anyway. Queen takes pawn check. Now if he moves over, so he has to do pawn up. Now all we do is queen to the 7th, threaten queen takes knight, not to mention queen to d7 checkmate. There's no way to defend both those threats. So that's that. Let's look at the position a little bit. I believe black wins this position. I think it's black's move, and our theme is rook to the 7th, so the obvious move is rook to f2, attacking toward the king that's on h2. Notice that our bishop on the black bishop on d7 is undefended and attacked by the knight. But white can't afford to do knight takes bishop because that knight on c5 is guarding the b3 square. So if the knight takes the bishop, then there's the rather nice checkmate, queen to b3, checkmate. So black doesn't have to be worried about leaving that bishop hanging on d7. So again, I think we're looking at rook to f2. Let's see. Yep, rook to f2. Okay, now the knight comes back. That attacks the rook, and it allows the queen to protect the b3 square to prevent queen to b3, and it also threatens knight takes bishop on the black queen. So it looks like a pretty decent move. White is threatening two pieces at one time. Of course, we know black's going to win, so all we have to do is find the win for black. Okay, I think who sees the win for black? What's black's winning move here? So I think knight to c4 is the move. Maybe I said c5, knight to c4. Yeah. So the rook has to come over and protect. That's interesting, though. It takes away a retreat square for the king. You see that? The king can't go to G1 now. So I wonder if there's some way we can find to attack the king. Again, white seems to be threatening two of our pieces at one time. I think I see a good move for black. Does anyone have any suggestions for black? Remember, white's threatening knight takes bishop. But what does, when the knight takes the bishop on d7, that knight was protecting some white squares back in white's position. We already mentioned g3, right? There's another key white square that knight protects. What square is that? When the knight's on c5, I mean. It protects a couple key white squares in white's position. What's the other one besides b3?
A4 as well.
A4. Okay. What else is protecting A4? Nothing. Maybe we move up our queen and attack A4. That prevents...
And you're also threatening queen A3. So from queen D4, yeah, you're threatening queen A3. You're also attacking A4.
Am I threatening queen A3?
No, the queen.
What's to prevent him from doing knight takes rook? Yeah, I don't see that.
Yeah, I don't think there is any. Yeah,
Okay, so maybe queen to b4 comes later. Looks like we're going to have to move our rook. We need to move our rook somewhere strong because knight takes bishop is going to threaten our queen, right? Where's this? We move the rook. What's the strongest threat we can make with the black rook? Yeah, attack the queen. Rook to d2 is my guess. Okay, now if knight takes bishop, we don't do rook takes queen because knight takes queen, he would be on our rook, right? But we have that move we talked about, Dennis, queen to g4, threatening queen takes pawn check, right? And we're on the queen. But could the queen go to g3 in that case? I mean b3. Maybe the queen could just go to b3 to protect the pawn. And do we have anything? So we take the queen. Let's go back and just take the queen. Knight take, okay. Okay, white does knight takes bishop, right? We take the queen. He takes our queen. We could take his queen with our, we could take his knight with our knight. Then we would have a knight, we would have two rooks, and we'd have a bishop on g5, right? And he would only have one knight left, right? So we'd be a piece up. Let's see what the author says. Okay, no, he moved the queen. Okay, so I guess that would win. We would do rook takes queen, we would win a piece. So he moved the queen, attacks our bishop. Now we move our queen up. So if knight takes, of course, queen takes pawn is checkmate. Oh, this is kind of pretty. Queen takes bishop. Who sees the checkmate now?
Well, now we are threatening queen.
Yeah, let's just do it. That's it. So Dennis, you had the idea. We just didn't. We had to work out the order to get it quite right. Well, this is pretty obvious that black is the attacker. Obviously, black can do rook to f7 and grab f2, grab the 7th rank, threaten rook to c2, king over, rook takes pawn check, and checkmate to follow. The question is there a defense for white? So if we play rook to f2 for black, white has to guard the c2 square. Now it looks like white would have a couple choices. White could play rook to d2, where the rook's protected by the queen and the king. Or he could try queen to c3. If he does rook to d2, though, notice that the other black rook is attacking the d4 pawn. So we could trade the rook and the queen. The king would come to d2, and we'd have rook takes pawn check, and we might have a winning ending. We'd have white would have 4 pawns, and black would have 6 pawns. So, rook to d2 is not going to cut it. Let's see what white tries. Okay, rook here. Oh, queen takes pawn, guarding c2. Okay, now we're attacking, black is attacking. Black would be foolish to allow the trade of queens, I believe. But if black plays queen takes pawn, looks like white could play rook to h1, attacking the queen, and the queen moves. We would have queen takes rook pawn check, right? But the queen can move with check. There's an f4 square that's check. That would force the trade of queens. Queen takes queen, rook takes queen. Then we would have 2 rooks on the d4 pawn. The d4 pawn can't be defended, and it can't advance. So it looks like we would win the ending. So I think queen takes rook pawn. Okay, so he took the c pawn. We already said rook to h1 doesn't work. Now it looks like we have rook takes b pawn. That looks pretty good. Anybody see anything better? Let's see. Yep, rook takes b pawn. I bet it's queen takes c7. Nope, queen to c3. Now, what does black do? Oh yeah, that's the right move. Rook to d to b8. Okay, threatening checkmate. It doesn't look like there's any good defense. He tries queen over, so he'll give up the queen for the 2 rooks. But we have a nice check. He can't interpose the queen. If he interposes the rook, we can do rook down check, king to c2, the other rook, king up there to c3, and we can do rook to b3 check and win the queen. So he has to go here. Now we jump over to c3, and that's it. He has no moves. Queen to c3, queen takes queen checkmate. All right. Obviously, white has the 2 rooks doubled on the e file, so we're going to talk about the rooks penetrating to e7. Can't do the rook to e7, though. Our queen's attacked by that knight. Notice that the knight on g5 is unprotected, and notice that with the pawn structure on the black king side, that the black squares are weak, the f6 square and the h6 square, the white knight and the white queen are on those squares and dominate those squares. So that should suggest the winning move. Who would like to propose a winning move for white here? We're not going to checkmate. We're going for a winning ending. We're going to go to the 7th rank with the rook and attack the b pawn and the b pawn on b7 and the pawn on f. Maybe we'll even be able to double rooks up or something. I'm not sure how it's all going to shake out. But we're playing for the better ending, not to checkmate. Any ideas? Okay, well, I said the f6 is a hole, right? Now we could do knight check. The king would have to go to h8. We'd have to move our queen, say, to f4 to protect the knight. Well, look, that other pesky knight. No, the other knight couldn't go to h5 because we'd have knight takes knight. And we are threatening queen takes knight on g5. Remember, our knight's on f6, so it blocks the queen, protecting the black knight. Maybe, but our queen's on f4. He could move his knight on g7 over to e6, where it attacks our queen on f4 and protects the knight on g5 at the same time. And our queen can only go to one square that protects the knight on f6. The queen could go to e5. And that would threaten a discovered check by the knight on f6 moving. So I would say it's not clear. Knight to f6 is not clear what's going to happen. Better for white is to go in with the queen. That takes the queen there. Basically, the threat is queen takes queen and then rook to e7, followed up by knight to f6. So moving the queen in, it got the queen out of danger from the black knight, and we capitalize on the weak black squares in the black's kingside position. So Black felt nothing better than that. Now the king moved over. Now look at the rather pitiful position of black's pieces. His king is stuck in the corner. His knights are on g7 and g5, not doing a whole lot. Now they can move to e6 though and block that e-file. Well, we're going to grab the e-file before he can block it, and then we'll threaten the pawn on b7, and at some point we can drop our knight from f6 to d7, and it can attack the rook on f8, and when the rook moves off f8, we might be able to take our rook on e7 and take the pawn on f7. Of course, we have to drive the knight from g4 first with a move like h4. The knight moves, and then we take the f7 pawn and probably win the game. So, rook down. He moves his rook over. Oh, and we fork him. That's easy enough. So that's all there was to that. Let's call up the notation. If he moved the other rook over, he would have avoided the knight fork of the two rooks, right, and protected the pawn. But look how bad the rooks are. They look silly there at b8 and a8 behind pawns. You never want to do that. So now we try to win the pawn on f7. We drive the knight back, and we take the pawn, and that's a one game. Oh, and there's a note. I would probably just take the pawn and be happy. The note says even stronger is h5, continuing the attack. Now, if knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, we do rook takes pawn, and that knight that's left on e6 is hanging, and if the knight moves, we can drop the 2 rooks and threaten rook takes rook pawn check. That's why h5 is stronger. He can try knight to f4. We attack the knight on g6. He moves the knight here. We move the knight here, attack. And now, oh, his knight on f4 is on our bishop, so all we have to do is retreat the bishop. And he has no good defense against rook takes pawn. Followed by the other rook coming down. So that wins. However, rook takes f7 is perfectly fine. Probably most of us would do that. So that's right. There's another possibility. Knight 5 to e6. We just take the pawn and we have a 1 ending. Rook f to b8. We take the f7 pawn and win. Okay, very good. Well, that'll cover it for tonight. Thanks for coming.